Hello, and welcome back to APIs You Won't Hate. My name is Mike Bifulco. I am one of your API co-hosts and guide through the world of designing APIs and building APIs and doing all sorts of good stuff with API tech. I am joined today for an interview with a new friend of mine, someone who I met at a conference here in North Carolina. We're going to be talking a little bit today about his project and some of the sort of mission of open source and supporting open source and things like that. So today I'm chatting with Dudley Carr from StackAid. Dudley, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Super happy to have you here. I have lots of questions for you, and I'm super glad you were able to make it because from our initial conversations when we sort of bumped into each other all over the place at All Things Open, your work seemed very interesting to me. And I think a lot of the squad here that is part of the APIs You Won't Hate community will really identify with what you're doing. So I want to talk all about that. I want to talk about how you got to where you are and what you're doing at StackAid, and to just kind of get some of the history on the project and yourself. So tell me a bit about yourself and tell me about StackAid.
Absolutely. So I've been in the software engineering space for the last 22 years. I did my undergraduate in computer science at Stanford and graduated at the peak of the dot-com bubble burst and briefly did a stint in finance. I actually worked at Lehman Brothers on their exotic derivatives until I realized that stuff is insane and I got out. In the last 20 years, I've spent all of it working with my brother, who also did computer science. And so we've gone from one venture to the next. So he is not here, but is probably the more important of the duo. And anyway, we did our first startup in Rhode Island in my parents' basement. I think there was radon in that basement, but we managed. We actually built in the 2002, 2003, we built a product that became Gtalker. It was Flash-based, pre-action. It was ActionScript, but before they released all of their UI toolkits and stuff like that. And the backend was Python. It was initially a desktop application, then became a web-based product. And I developed that out and ended up selling that to Google and moving to Seattle in 2006 to join the Google Talk team and work on that. And we spent about 5 years at Google going from one project to the next. First, we were in apps, and then eventually I worked on Google Voice and then before leaving. So that was super formative for us. We learned a lot of things, met a lot of great people. I think that was kind of the heyday for Google. And then after that, we did some more startups, food related things. And then we joined a company called Moz that does SEO here in Seattle. And we spent another 4 or 5 years there. I helped run a large portion of their engineering team and then grew some of their product areas. That was also really formative for us in terms of, understanding that space, growing teams, and, just going through various product life cycles and things like that. At the end of our Moz experience, we actually did another startup with a friend here in Seattle around crowdfunding. And this was actually crowdfunding for sports teams. So there was another platform that was really taking off. We found out about Stripe Connect and started using that. And really the basis for it was, you have like a high school football team. They're selling candy bars and things like that. There's a lot of inefficiencies there. And there's a lot of price gouging actually by merchants who sell products to schools to do that. And so there was, 2017, 2018, there was a real impetus to, move all of that stuff online. And we have a lot of learnings that I think happy to chat about, but that was kind of formative for us in terms of thinking about, how you move money from a set of people who want to support something to the recipients and what all is involved in that. That was also just kind of how we transitioned from that into consulting. So we've been doing consulting for the last 4 years. We're kind of embedded engineers and product specialists inside of organizations and to help them transform companies. And that gives us a ton of flexibility and allows us to do cool things like what we've done over the last couple of years. At the beginning of the pandemic, by the way, we launched something called COVID Trace. So we had the hot idea to do contact tracing. We tried to launch an app, immediately was blocked by Google and Apple.
Oh,
so
wow.
nope, you're not doing anything location-based. And we're going to sort this out first, which is great. I think it was totally the right move on their part. We ended up adopting the exposure notification APIs that they have. And we ended up, I think we were the second app to launch in the United States. And so we launched with the state of Nevada and worked with them over the course of 2 years doing exposure notifications, rolling that out for iOS and Android, and then eventually moving all of Nevada off of our custom app onto iOS's built-in exposure notification functionality. And at the same time, building out other things in terms of getting results to people and things like that. So really interesting problems around health, totally unanticipated. So that was all open source. We released all of that infrastructure open source in the apps. And then, about a year ago, we started on Stackade.
Wow.
So
that's some incredible back history there. I was not prepared for that much incredible problem solving that you've gotten into in your career. For sure, as someone who lived through an entire pandemic of being, locked in my home and not leaving and being very concerned about public health and those things, super, super cool to hear you worked on that and obviously impacted so many people and also, collaborated with the big organizations like Apple and Google. That's massively cool to hear. I also don't think I realized that you and I had some sort of shared overlap, not overlap, but maybe an odd Venn diagram of career stuff. Before working at Stripe, I worked at Google for a couple of years, not quite on Google Voice, on Google Assistant. So voice related stuff at Google, although I'm no longer there. And actually probably worth mentioning for posterity, since you and I met at All Things Open, I'm also no longer at Stripe. So I've left Stripe in the past couple of weeks, but I'm very curious to hear about your experiences with Stripe Connect and all of that. And so all of this history of all the crazy things you've done and like working with complex teams and big problems and across devices and problem spaces, and I'm sure languages and all the other things that have changed since 2003 when you first got into the world of building things has led you to where you're at now. So tell me a little bit about Stackade and what you're doing there.
Yeah, so Stackade is a service that allows you to fund your first order and second order dependencies automatically. The impetus for it came about a year and a half ago when we, repeatedly saw articles about people exasperated by their inability to sustain their open source project because, the demands have increased on what they have to deliver, and the reach of their open source is beyond their wildest dreams. But, they basically pay for it in their spare time, or it takes away from other paying opportunities that they have. And so you see a lot of people kind of torn in those situations. That really resonated with us. As I mentioned, we had spent time in the fundraising arena, and we saw definitely momentum around GitHub sponsors and Open Collective, but we thought that there was an opportunity there. I think what's super interesting about the software development space, as opposed to any other space where people are trying to raise money, is that we know what you use, right? There's sometimes it's imperative, but increasingly it's a declarative way of specifying all your dependencies, and so we can do so many things automatically to determine what you use and potentially influence how we allocate money. And so that seed of an idea was there, and we started exploring, the feasibility of it and what that would look like, and is it an effective model, things like that. And so that's been the last year, and it's been super interesting, kind of fleshing that out. And we've been super happy with the results and the initial reception when we launched a couple of months ago.
So I've seen it and I'm sort of familiar with the product, but I want to make sure that, it's abundantly clear what you mean when you're talking about this. So we're talking about funding open source projects in a way that is sort of sustainable and based on your dependency graph for projects that you're using. So when you say first and second order dependencies, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so by first order, so let's take a package.json in the Node ecosystem. If the first order dependencies are the dependencies and dev dependencies that you list directly in that package.json. Now, those first order dependencies in turn have their own package.json where they list their dependencies. That would be the second order dependencies. Now, you can walk that tree down all the way down, and there are going to be lots and lots more. So it's not unusual for a project to have literally thousands of dependencies in their dependency tree. But, from a funding perspective, you have to draw the line somewhere. Otherwise, you take a certain amount of money and divide it into tiny little pieces and it becomes somewhat meaningless. So we wanted to, the easy thing would be to just fund first order dependencies. But we realized, a lot of those open source projects also want to give back. And if we, defaults matter. And we realized that if we came up with a mechanism that, when you fund a first order dependency, it passes some of that on to its dependencies. You're doing that automatically for the ecosystem. You don't have to have everyone opt in order to have further reach into the ecosystem. And so, that was the impetus to fund first and second order dependencies.
Yeah, got it. So from I don't even know what you would consider to be the end user, but from the perspective of someone who is doing the funding, doing the supporting, what does that look like? Like, what is the process for me, say for a project I'm running? Let's say APIsYouWon'tHate.com, right? It's a Node.js project. We've got a whole heap of dependencies that are sort of built into this thing. What would I need to do to adopt Stackade?
That's a great question. So, when you go to stackade.us, there's the first step in the onboarding process is OAuthing with GitHub and actually adding the GitHub app to either your personal organization or some other organization where repositories are. We then scan those repositories for, files like package.json or, others depending on whatever language you're using. And we use those declarative list of dependencies. We ingest that and start looking at that dependency tree. Once we have that, we put you in the dashboard. We show you what we had discovered, like which files and which repositories we're pulling from. And we presume initially that you want to fund all of those. You can be selective, right? So I want to fund these repositories and these package.json, things like that. Based on the first order and second order dependencies, we pulled from that. And you can then indicate a level of support that you want to do on a monthly basis. We then calculate how much would go to each of those projects. So it's hard to describe, but there's a tree that we have in the dashboard, and it shows you, okay, you've got React or Lodash, for example, as a first order dependency. It has these second order dependencies, and it shows you the amount of your subscription that goes to each one of those. And so that breaks down. The next step is to enter a credit card, and then you're off to the races.
Yeah. Okay. So from my perspective, it is, auth with GitHub, get this thing added to my to my GitHub organization. It'll go and I guess introspect and look at, or I guess inspect is probably even the right word there. Go look at all the projects I have and give me the first and second order dependencies for each. Is the target then from there to say, like, just using easy numbers, I want to donate $100 a month to these various organizations. I have one fixed cost, and Stackade kind of does the rest from there.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So I feel like I have so many questions. How does the money get from A to B? Like, how do you track down the various projects that are then being funded?
Yeah. So that's the fun part about building something like this, is because it's effectively kind of like a marketplace, right? I mean, we're engaging with both individual developers and companies who are supporters, and of course, have a relationship with open source maintainers. So we have slowly been reaching out to open source maintainers kind of as we drive awareness, or if they're receiving funding, we will reach out to them individually. But we also have been realizing that, a lot of these people don't know who we are. There's a lot of things grabbing at their attention. So if they have an existing relationship with GitHub sponsors or Open Collective, we actually just use our corporate credit card and make the donation on those platforms. So our goal is to get the money in their hands. And if they have an existing relationship, we lean on that. So that's worked out well. But primarily over time, I think for the ease of developers and to give them more control in terms of, how those funds are allocated, especially if there are multiple people working on a project, things like, we would like people to, claim their project on Stackade.
Yeah, sure. What does that look like?
So we use Stripe Connect underneath. So, when you log into the dashboard and you OAuth, you also have to OAuth with GitHub. At the moment, we're working on other hosting platforms, but you OAuth and we actually verify that you actually are a maintainer on those repositories that you're trying to claim. We list out those repositories, you claim them, and then as part of that claiming process, we also need to collect a Stripe account. So we send you over to Stripe. They get all of the details necessary to basically give us a Stripe account so that we can deposit funds into at the end of the month. And then that's it. Then you're able to collect money from Stackade.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. So I'd imagine there's some population of people who are very pleased to find out they can come to Stackade, click a couple of buttons, and have money being funneled into their project every month. That's got to feel pretty cool to be able to, I don't know, land that dream so seamlessly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks more to Stripe than to us. I mean, honestly, that flow is amazing, and there's so much complexity abstracted. But I think from a end developer perspective, it is surprisingly easy to get up and running. And yeah, and I think it's pretty great, when you show up, that a lot of the times there's, a couple of bucks at the very least waiting for you there, and you immediately get that. I think that has been an important part of Stackade, which is, you don't have to be a developer. Like, the developer doesn't have to have an account in order for money to accrue for them. So, you have this kind of problem, I think, on GitHub sponsors and Open Collective initially, where people didn't have a relationship with those platforms, so there wasn't a way to get money to them. A lot of people have set it up, but there's also a large portion of the ecosystem that has no relationship with them. And so it was important for us to be able to accrue money and, show people that you can actually, there's money in the open source that they've contributed, and have that as a carrot for them to sign up.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting model. And having been exposed to GitHub sponsors a little bit, I know that one of the nice things that comes along with this actually might be a Stripe Connect requirement, but to access Stripe Connect, you have to essentially have viable tax information, right? Like the right information to be able to be paid out, so that you're not just, sending off money to some anonymous bucket somewhere, but instead theoretically it's tied to like an LLC or an individual proprietor, or a more complex corporation in the case of bigger businesses. But a lot of that is, I would imagine, abstracted away from you. You just need them to click the button and connect to Stackade with Stripe Connect.
One of the biggest concerns that we had out of the gate was, all open source doesn't happen in the United States. There are people across the world. And the United States in particular has a requirement called Know Your Customer. Mm-hmm. And so you need a lot of details in order to verify their identity and make sure that this isn't for money laundering or some other scheme like that. And so that is actually all abstracted away for us. And that is pretty phenomenal. If we, a two-person operation, there's just no way you're going to do that.
The scope and scale of those money laundering operations is far more complex and sophisticated than, I think we might realize as sort of an average consumer. Again, I'm not at Stripe any longer, but during my tenure there, you do financial crimes training, and it's pretty astonishing the creative ways people, will go to lengths to make money disappear or just harder to trace or whatever the case may be. And nice that you don't have to worry about that. There's a lot of mechanisms in place to detect and prevent that fraud as well. Okay, so I want to know a little bit about what signals were you given that this was something that was going to work? In other words, that when you're starting to build Stackade, because it's only a year and change old at this point, was there a moment or a series of events that sort of made you feel like, oh, this is something that actually has some momentum behind it?
Yeah, I think we had to prove to ourselves that it's viable. And, there's some nuance to the model in terms of how we distribute that money. And more importantly, what's interesting about this problem is that it's not a one-time thing. So if no one shows up to collect the money, what do you do with that money? So there's a time component to it as well.
Yeah.
And there's complexity around the model to some degree in terms of implementing and doing it right. And we knew that the model itself needed to be validated and be comparable to things like GitHub sponsors and Open Collective. So we actually spent a large portion of the development time building out a simulation. And so there's a simulation.stackade.us it's effectively it's our entire site, but it has 5,000 made up subscribers at various price points using package.jsons that we had discovered on GitHub using SourceGraph. SourceGraph was pretty instrumental in terms of doing that. And we needed package.jsons that weren't on NPM, right? We didn't want to grab Lodash's package.json accidentally, and because that's not representative of potential end users. So we took those 5,000 subscribers, plugged them in, gave them some subscription amount between $25 per month to $100 per month. And we just looked to see what happens, right? What's the outcome of this? Like, is it just a couple of projects that get all the money, or, what does that distribution look like? And the end result is that, you still have a power law curve, just like you do on GitHub sponsors and Open Collective, but it was more stretched out. So we ended up funding a larger percentage of let's say the top 25% of funds included a significantly larger set of projects. So even though they're at the tip of this power law curve, there's more of them included. That's great. But the middle was much broader, right? A lot more of the money was going into that. And so that was the validation that we needed, right? Internally, to know that, we can reach more of this. I think in terms of the broader readiness for this type of product, I think, there's just a drumbeat of vulnerabilities, and also just individuals really talking about the lack of funding, the lack of maintenance around this. And so that is the validation that we continue to look for, as an opportunity to do something about. I think we're very nascent in terms of evangelizing this and driving awareness. But I think, those two things kind of has given us the confidence that, the timing is hopefully right and it's the right product for the time.
Yeah. It's an interesting it's not that you have a chicken and an egg problem to work with, but I feel like the whole funding nut to crack is that we all on some level, developers, engineering teams, or organizations, understand that it's important to keep these projects funded so that they stay up to date, so that vulnerabilities get shut down, bugs get addressed, functionality gets added, whatever the case may be. It seems like a lot of the social pressure lands on individuals to do the funding in a lot of ways. And I think that maybe is a law of numbers thing. People, you get a lot more call to action as an individual to go fund things. But my guess is that the bulk of the volume of money is coming from organizations who are willing to fund open source things. Is that roughly right?
Yeah. So we actually were able to analyze all of the Open Collective transactions. They do this amazing job of every transaction on the open source collective on Open Collective. You can literally download all of the transactions. And so I did that and I went and analyzed them. And yes, organizations like Google and others, they do put in a ton of money. But if I remember correctly, I would say over 60% of it are from individuals donating at much smaller amounts. So they have a long tail, and it is a significant portion of the contributions. And so it wasn't as skewed as you would think towards large organizations.
That is a bigger percentage than I would have guessed. That's really interesting. So what is your call to action, or maybe your pitch for those who might have the capacity to donate? How is is there a sales process for this? Is it something that you're going to organizations and people and trying to get them to discover and use Stackade as donors?
I think there are certain organizations that are very attuned to open source, and they have open source program offices, and they are actively engaging those communities, and they're looking, they're either doing this themselves. So Sentry is a customer of Stackade, and they did a ton of this by themselves. They wrote custom things to analyze their dependencies, and they had a big spreadsheet, and it's super impressive, but it's incredibly time consuming. And I think Indeed and others are also analyzing their dependencies and trying to figure out where to allocate money. So this is something that is happening today. Yeah. So we're looking to engage with those types of organizations and understand, how Stackade can potentially be a part of that. So I think step one is to really engage with organizations that are receptive to it. I think that's the kind of low-hanging fruit. And I think beyond that, there's organizations that are certainly consuming a large portion of open source. And, there's kind of a different sales process around, here are the ways that you engage with open source at those organizations. Funding is one aspect of that. And so I think over time, that's where that conversation's going. But I think the organizations that are currently funding open source to some degree, they're kind of making the case for that. And we we're trying to expand that conversation and as well as piggyback off of that.
Right. Yeah. It's nice that it's kind of the zeitgeist, is that it seems that support has really changed in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years, to like open source is something we can try or should try, to open source is something that, is the infrastructure of the internet in a lot of ways, and something that, almost the ethical impetus is to support open source projects and to also be a part of that if you're able. Okay, I guess one more important question then: if I'm an open source developer, what are actions I can take to be proactive about, I guess, making sure that I'm covered by Stackade, or that, that I'm doing the right things to seek funding?
Yeah, I think, what one theory that we have is that, there are organizations like we were just talking about that are attuned and are willing to donate, but I actually think a fundamental shift is dependent on individual developers donating and independent of the platform, but actively participating in that way of funding open source, be it GitHub sponsors, Open Collective, Stackade, Thanks.dev. Any of those platforms is a good way to start, but there has, we have to have that expectation that developers are doing this just like they do other types of open source contributions. And I think that groundswell of developers participating and educating and kind of demanding this in their organizations is what actually turns the tide. And so our focus initially is actually to get individual developers to come on board. And we hope that we're, one of those solutions that makes it a lot simpler. But if GitHub sponsors is the way that you do it, great, right? Go on there, fund the people or the projects that you really care about. But I think that speaks volumes, right? And that I think is the thing that actually moves the needle. And those platforms have made it simpler. We hopefully have made it simpler based on, what some set of people care about. But, our goal is to evangelize individual developers contributing more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a noble conceit, and definitely one of those things that I think all of the people listening to the show can probably relate to. I certainly identify with it. One of the things I've been mulling over a lot lately, especially in the past few weeks, I've been like reconsidering my personal budget and the way I allocate money for things, is that I think I would like to be a little more public in sharing and explaining the ways that I spend money in for good ways, right? Like charities that I donate to on one side, but open source things that I donate to, projects that I support. And also, this is more on the creator economy side, but like Patreon, things like that, where there's like, I love this podcast, so I give them $1 a month, which is, more than they would ever get from me clicking on ads. I could click ads every day for a week and I wouldn't give them $1. And it goes a lot further than you'd think. And it's funny, I've been kind of thinking that that's something that belongs in my almost public profile. Like I should be sharing this somewhere and making that a part of my persona, my support for the world. And I think that that's something that we have a great opportunity to do with projects like Stackade and with other things that we all participate in, because it also creates that social pressure and that impression, that expectation, that part of being a good citizen as a developer, when you can, and if you can, and if you have, the mountains of privilege that I'm sitting on top of, like you should be giving back. I really like that. And one of the things that I like about Stackade is honestly the tree view of the dependencies, and seeing the amount of impact that even a few bucks a month can have is like visceral. And you really feel like you see that not only are you using this cascade of things to power whatever project you're working on, but you can also give back to them fairly directly. And there's infrastructure in place to do that for you. I think that's really exciting. And I think it's a noble cause. And I'm hoping it's something that a lot of the folks who are listening to the podcast will be able to jump into and go headlong into supporting, but also benefiting from.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think what you're saying really resonates with us, in that how you spend your money matters. We are in a position of privilege where, we have discretionary money that we can funnel towards things. And I think you nailed it. A lot of these developers are getting, at the moment, maybe a couple of bucks per month. We're still small, but I think it really matters to those developers, partly because it is a real recognition of what they're doing. And they know that someone took the time and their money to do that. And I think that's super powerful. I think it's easy to dismiss it as, it's a trivial sum of money or something of the sort. But, when you're working on something, and a lot of times, you can look at your NPM install numbers like, oh yeah, that's through the roof. But this is, getting an email from someone saying like, I like your project, that's really visceral as well. But also just like people actually just paying. I think that's an incredible way. And so hopefully people are not put off by, initially like, oh, the dollar amounts are not significant, but it supports that individual at so many different levels. And so, how you spend your money matters, and it has a really great upside on the other side of it.
Yeah, it's pretty profound and an energizing thing for me. Well, Dudley, thanks so much for coming and hanging out today. I have two important questions for you before I let you go. One is I want to know how APIs You Won't Hate listeners can find you and talk to you if they're interested. And where can they go to get started with Stackade?
Absolutely. Yeah, so you can email me at Dudley, Dudley, at stackade.us. And our website is stackade.us. I think if you search for Stackade on Google, we're number one. And, as we were chatting earlier, it's super simple to get started. If you run into any issues, please reach out and we're happy to answer questions. But it's pretty self-service at the moment. Just click on the button OAuth, and then hopefully you're off to the races. And always looking for more feedback. And we appreciate every person who signs up, and happy to answer questions.
Great. Wonderful. Dudley, thanks so much for hanging out today. It's been a pleasure having you. And I'd love to catch up again, maybe in a few months or a year down the line to see how things are going.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Take care.
Bye-bye.